Hello, welcome to my true criminal abode. As ever, you are very, very welcome. It is lovely to see you here. Today's case is literally every woman's worst nightmare. In 1974, Renae Wicklund had her whole life ahead of her. She worked hard, striving to build a bright future for herself and her young daughter, Shannah. And basically Renae's life, it was peaceful and it was full of promise. But all of that was shattered in an instant. Charles Rodman Campbell turned Renae's life into a nightmare, dragging her family and community into a devastating storm of stalking, revenge, and ended with a triple murder that would forever change the lives of multiple families, and literally turns into one of the worst revenge cases that I've ever heard. What makes this story even more devastating is the sheer frustration that it brings. It's not just the horror of the crimes themselves, which are horrendous on their own, but it's the fact that they were even allowed to happen in the first place because of a justice system that failed. A system that basically enabled a man with a criminal history. They allowed this man with a massive red flag stuck up his you-know-what to walk free. It should never have happened. On a positive note, though, this case is an important one to cover because it did change laws. And it goes to show that things do change. It's just so damn frustrating because it took the deaths of 3 innocent people for the legal system to react, to change. It's heartbreaking, it's tragic, and it's frustrating as hell. Anyway, as usual, my usual trigger warning. It's a tough one today, and like I always say, your mental health, it comes first. So I really do mean it when I say, look after yourself. So let's get on with the heartbreaking and incredibly frustrating case of Charles Rodman Campbell. So a little bit of background about Renae Wicklund. Renae, she was a beautiful, kind, intelligent, courageous woman. She was born on the 20th of February 1952 in North Dakota to Alan and Hilda Ehlers. She grew up in a close-knit family with a sister and a half-sister and 2 half-brothers. When her family moved to a rural town in North Dakota, they settled on a farm. And Renae, she absolutely thrived, embracing the responsibilities of farm life. She was a devoted animal lover. At some point in her life, she had a pet horse, she had a pet raccoon. And basically, when they moved to this farm life remained an important part of her heart throughout her life. Now, she was energetic, she was bright, she had this natural talent for excelling in absolutely everything that she did. She was a dedicated member of the 4-H Club. Her hard work and passion earned her multiple special achievement medals. If you're outside the US, like I am, and you're like, what the hell is the 4-H Club? It's basically a youth development kind of organisation that empowers young people through hands-on learning and leadership opportunities and community engagement, that kind of thing. Renae was also musically gifted. She shone as a majorette and a flutist. These were talents that caught the eye of Valley City State College, who recruited Renae after she graduated from high school in 1970 for her exceptional musical abilities. Now, in 1971, Renae moved to California, But she soon found herself drawn to Washington State after she visited her sister there. She was absolutely captivated by the beauty of the Puget Sound area, and so she decided to make it her home. She quit college and she began working at a beauty salon in Seattle, and it was here that she met Jack Wicklund. He was a car salesman, 14 years her senior. So he had been married before. I think he had a couple of kids as well. But despite this age difference, the pair fell in love and they married in 1973. Renae and Jack soon settled into a quaint town called Clearview, also in Washington State, and it was located in Snohomish County. Now, Clearview was one of these small, kind of close-knit communities. It was nestled in woods, and basically it seemed like the perfect place for them to raise a family. Their home sat on just over an acre of land, and it allowed Renae to kind of maintain that connection to the rural lifestyle, the farming lifestyle that she'd grown up with and loved. So it was just ideal for Renae. And by the time they moved in, Renae was already pregnant with their first child. And on 27th of August 1973, Renae and Jack welcomed their daughter Shannah into the world. Now, Shannah, she was described as a beautiful little replica of her mother, a little mini-me. And she obviously completed their family. Also, what Renae loved about this community was her neighbours. She grew incredibly close to some neighbours that she had across the street. Their names were Barbara Hendrickson and her husband, Don Hendrickson. They had lived in the community for kind of over a decade, and they raised their own family there. They were well-known, well-liked members of the community. They were just this lovely, kind-hearted couple that really took Renae and her daughter Shannah under their wing and treated them like members of their own family. Barbara obviously was quite a bit older than Renae, but she became a source of wisdom and support for Renae, who was a young mother at the time. And Jack was often away for work, so Renae really appreciated the help and the support and the companionship that Barbara Hendrickson offered her. Basically, Renae's dream life was all there. It was all within reach. She was just happy and really, really optimistic for a future that lay ahead of her. But you know what I'm going to say. When you say everything's going great, something bad is around the corner. And yeah, this idyllic world that Renae had created for herself, it was on the brink of devastation. And basically the lives of the Wicklunds and the Hendricksons, both of these families, their lives would soon be tragically changed forever. On the 11th of December 1974, Renae took advantage of an unseasonably warm and sunny day. Usually the weather in Washington State in December would be kind of snowy and cold, and this day it was warm and sunny, and she took advantage of that and decided to clean the outside windows of her home. Now, Jack was at work that day, but Renae, she didn't worry when her husband was away because it was a safe neighbourhood. And she knew that the Hendricksons were across the street if she needed anything. So she set Shannah down on the grass. Shannah is about a year old at this point, and she began cleaning her windows. Suddenly, she sees a human shape. It kind of caught the corner of her eye. She glances up, and she saw a tall white man with bushy hair walking up her driveway. He's pretty distinctive. Now, strangers rarely pass by, so she was a bit taken aback. So she stopped what she was doing and obviously stared at him. As she stops to stare at him, however, he turns around and he starts walking back towards the road. Renae's a bit confused, but equally didn't think too much of it because she thought, well, he's probably got halfway up her drive and thought, oh no, I'm at the wrong house, and just turned around again. So she carries on cleaning her windows. As she carries on, she suddenly notices the same man walking up her driveway again. This time, however, he was sprinting towards her, literally legging it towards her. She absolutely panics. She rushes for Shannah because her first reaction is, oh my God, this man has come for my daughter. Because as a mother, you're going to instinctively just go straight into protection mode over your child. So she bolts towards Shannah, scoops her up as fast as she can, and runs towards the house. She gets inside, she gets to the door, but before she could get inside properly and close the door behind her fully, this man was there, and he was pushing the other side of the door. Now, she's obviously pushing against the door, trying to get it locked. She's got Shannah in one arm, though, as well. And this guy is pushing from the other side. She tries desperately. She uses all her weight to push against this door to stop this man coming in. But he is a big man, and with her daughter in her arm as well. There was just nothing she could do. And before she knew it, this guy was standing in her living room. And he had this crazed look in his eyes. And her fears, her worst nightmare, was realised when this man got out a knife. And he basically waved this knife at Shannah, at her daughter. And she is going to do whatever he says. He tells her to take off her clothes. He threatens to kill Shannah if she doesn't do what he wants her to do. She cannot refuse. She's got no choice. She has to comply with what he wants. So she takes her clothes off and she is standing naked in her living room. Shannah, her daughter, is crying hysterically beside her. The man then demands that she perform oral sex on him. Again, what is she going to do? He's threatening her daughter. She is going to comply and do what he wants, and so she does. She submits to. It's horrifying. It's disgusting. It's absolutely disgusting. When the man was satisfied, he thanked Renae and walked out of the house. He thanked her. What the actual hell? Did he think that if he thanked her, that it would somehow make it okay? Mind boggles, right? Anyway, Renae runs to the bathroom and immediately washes out her mouth. It's disgusting. She throws her clothes back on, she grabs her daughter, and she runs across the street to the nearest safe space that she can think of, which is the Hendricksons' home. Barbara takes one look at Renae and immediately knew that something was horribly wrong. Renae's face was white as a sheet. She was hysterical. Shannah is grabbing onto her for dear life. Renae is absolutely overwhelmed with terror at the thought of this man returning. She could barely speak as she tried to explain what had happened. Barbara, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed her gun, she locked all the doors, she locked all the windows, and basically the two women sat together and waited for the police to arrive. When the authorities did arrive, Renae knew what this man looked like. She was not going to forget that face. It was going to be imprinted in her brain forever. So she was able to give a really, really good description of this man. He was tall, he had this frizzy reddish hair. She described what he was wearing. She said that he seemed to be in his early 20s. There was a faint odour of alcohol as well on his breath. She gave a really good description. And basically the Snohomish County Police, pretty much straight away, they had a good idea who this man was. They had a mugshot on their records of this man, who they believed it was, and he pretty much matched Renae's description perfectly. This man's name was Charles Rodman Campbell, but it would take just over a year before they were able to finally apprehend him. So he is on the run for a year. And during this time, obviously, Renae is deeply traumatized. She's living in constant fear, haunted by the possibility of another attack. It must be terrifying just knowing he's out there somewhere. And sadly, this emotional strain took a heavy toll on her relationship to Jack, on their marriage. Sexual assault can have a profound impact on relationships. Survivors, they often face psychological challenges like PTSD, depression, anxiety, all these things that can put a massive strain on even the strongest of relationships. You know, it makes things like trust in a relationship difficult, intimacy difficult, all these things. And it's really, really sad. But Jack and Renae, they ended up separating. Now, Jack moved out of the house. Renae and Shannah, they stayed in their Clearview home. I'm not quite sure how I would feel about that, staying in the same house where I was attacked. But why should she be the one that moves out anyway? It's her home. And despite the separation, however, Renae and Jack, they did stay on good terms because they had Shannah, they had their daughter, and they were determined not to let their marriage breakdown kind of affect Shannah too much. So there is that. But still, with Jack gone, you know, she spent her days consumed by paranoia. She was looking over her shoulder all the time. She just didn't know if this man was going to come back for her. And throughout it all, she was incredibly grateful for the unwavering support of her neighbours who stood by her during this really difficult time. Finally, however, in March 1976, so just over a year later, she gets that news that she had been praying for. The police arrested Charles Campbell for burglary, for something else. But it didn't matter. They had him finally. That monster had been caught at last. So who was Charles Rodman Campbell, and how come the police already had a record of him on their files? So Charles Campbell, he was born on the 21st of October 1954 in Hawaii to Betty Lou and Oliver Campbell. Now, Oliver Campbell, he was in the Marines. Now, he left the Marines and moved his family to Snohomish County in Washington State, and that's where they settled permanently. Charles had 3 siblings, the youngest of whom was born with a severe disability affecting her hip joints. Now, the stress of raising a large family, including a child with significant health challenges, it took its toll on Oliver and Betty Lou. And both parents, they ended up turning to alcohol and they became severe alcoholics. Yeah, just do your parenting, you know, not, I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, according to Charles, this environment led to severe abuse directed at him. Charles also faced bullying at school. His Hawaiian descent, it made him stand out, and he was often teased about his crippled sister as well. And so he was an angry child, and he was always defending himself, defending his sister. When he was 5 years old, he had a medical issue as well, which resulted in the removal of one of his testicles. Psychologists would later suggest that this may have contributed to his behavioural issues as a child and going into adulthood. Now, I kind of looked into this, and whilst it might have some physical or hormonal effects, they're usually manageable as the body will kind of compensate. So, you know, the testicle that's remaining will kind of overcompensate for the one that's been removed. From what I can tell, the research I've done, it shouldn't really have made that much of a difference. The causes of his violent behaviour that we're going to see, they are most likely more rooted in a combination of psychological, environmental, societal factors like trauma, upbringing, personality disorders, rather than a single kind of physical event. Obviously, make your own minds up, I'm not a doctor. So, Charles is living amongst the abuse, the drinking, the fighting, and ultimately he grows into an angry, troubled child. And he begins acting out in increasingly violent ways. He attended multiple elementary schools due to this aggressive behaviour, and he was eventually labelled as behaviourally disordered. And when a child is given a label, it's not supposed to stigmatise at all. It's supposed to encourage, help and support. He really should have got some help. And I don't know whether he did. I just get the impression that he probably didn't, or nothing that really benefited him anyway. So by the age of 10, he started drinking, and basically he followed his parents' footsteps. And very soon, obviously, this developed into criminal behaviour, beginning with things like vandalism. By the age of 12, he was using drugs like speed and meth. And by the age of 13, he added heroin to his drug use. His behaviour is spiralling out of control, and eventually he adds LSD. He also had no stable home life, really, because his parents, they were so engrossed in their own drinking that they didn't deal with him the way that they should have done. And they would send him to live with his grandparents. So Charles was basically shuttled between his own family home and his grandparents' home, and it was kind of just going back and forth and never really having any stability. And that's going to be incredibly dysfunctional, because you're not going to feel like you belong anywhere. You're going to feel like nobody really wants you. You know, each side is doing a bit to care, but not properly, not wholeheartedly, that a child needs. And so by the age of 15, he had all but stopped attending school, and his criminal activity was increasing. By the time he was 16, he was stealing cars, he was leading police on car chases. By the age of 17, in 1971, he actually stole the family car. And what happened was Oliver, his father, turned his son in to the police. Now, when Charles was arrested, he was so angry at his father, and he made a phone call from custody to a friend and basically told his friend to murder his father in retaliation. Now, here we see the beginnings of this angry young man turning to retaliating against other people. He's not taking any responsibility for his own actions. He's not saying, yeah, I did this, it's my fault. He is blaming other people instead. Instead of blaming himself, he is saying, well, it's your fault because you turned me in. I could have got away with this. And this is the beginning of us seeing this kind of revengeful side of his personality. Now, unfortunately, these violent tendencies, his criminal behaviour, all of that, it just persisted. It just got worse. He was charged with auto theft, resisting arrest, also threatening to kill the officers who arrested him. And a few days later, he broke into his grandparents' home, the grandparents who had taken him in at the times when his parents wouldn't look after him, and he stole several of their guns, and he intended to sell them to fund a trip to California. Now, during his arrest, he kicked a window in and he coldly remarked, "That's to thank you for what you've done for me." He has got no loyalty to the family. You can just see the anger. It's just this anger and this blaming everybody else for his problems. Now, when the police arrested him, they noticed all these, track marks from the drugs up his arms, and they asked him what he'd been using. And he replied, everything except Kool-Aid and peanut butter. So basically, he is just cocky as hell, doesn't give a damn about anybody and all the problems he's going through. Everything that happens to him, it's everybody else's fault but his. So Charles is sent off to Greenhill Reformatory for Boys in Chehalis for auto theft, and he's basically placed on probation for second-degree burglary. This is an angry young man, and he faced very few consequences for his actions. He was very often getting little more than a slap on the wrist, basically. And this lack of accountability just reinforced his belief that he could do whatever he wanted without repercussions. So, by the time Charles is 19, somehow, I don't know how, but somehow he managed to find a woman to marry him. The couple moved into a trailer near to his grandparents' home, and Charles hadn't changed. Even marriage didn't change him. The marriage quickly descended into chaos. The police were frequently called to the property due to violent domestic disputes. Charles beat his wife relentlessly. He threatened to kill their dog. He threatened to kill his wife's mother, his wife's sister. He basically instilled this constant fear into her, which meant that she was too scared to report him, because if she reported him, he'd kill someone she loved. She was terrified of him. Now, she got pregnant, and even then, that did nothing to curb his violent tendencies. So even while she was pregnant, he was still physically assaulting her. In March 1974, their daughter was born. But again, his behaviour, it didn't change. It was even more disturbing. He would throw butcher knives at the baby's crib when she cried. Father of the year? Not. Unsurprisingly, this marriage, it didn't last. And thankfully, the wife, she did get the courage to leave him. He was ordered by the courts to pay $75 a month in child support, but his visitation rights ended up being revoked because he was just so violent. He had this awful history of physical abuse and neglect that the judge determined that he posed a serious threat to the safety of his ex-wife and his child. And so even his visitation rights over his daughter were revoked. Now, just 4 months later, in December 1974, he is a volatile and angry 20-year-old. And this is when he showed up at Renae Wicklund's home, sexually assaulted her, and threatened Shannah, the baby. And as you can see from his treatment of his own baby, he doesn't care. He doesn't care that it's a child. He just cares about getting what he wants. So days after the assault, Charles abruptly quits his job at a pizza restaurant. He'd been working there under a false name, under the name Dan Leslie Kyle. Should have been Vile. But anyway, he abruptly leaves. He stole $1,200 from the cash register and he just basically vanished, never to return. And this is where basically for the next year, he vanishes. The police have no idea what he's up to, what he's doing. And no doubt he is going to be still committing terrible offences. And he is. However, the police have no idea what he is up to. And so I'm not going to confuse things. I'm not going to confuse issues and tell you now the terrible thing he does. I will tell you at the end what he does. But right now, there is no relevance to this case because the police never find out, well, they don't find out for like 50 years what he had done. But as far as the police are concerned, they have no idea where he is or what he's up to. Now, as for Renae, you can imagine she is terrified. She spends this next year living in absolute fear. Her marriage is broken up as well. She's on her own with her daughter, and she is just constantly looking over her shoulders. And it wasn't until January 1976 when she gets that news that he has been caught for burglary, and that's when they finally have him. And basically what happened was he had broken into somebody's home with a sawed-off shotgun, and they later found him drinking at a nearby bar, alcohol being his crux. So he was arrested and charged with second-degree burglary. Like I say, there is other stuff that he did, and he should have been charged with that stuff at this time as well. But the police had no idea, and I will tell you at the end what it was that he did. So for now, he's charged with second-degree burglary, and they also have him for Renae's assault, obviously. So Renae is asked to identify him, and she doesn't hesitate. It's literally scarred in her brain what this man looks like. So he is then officially connected to her assault, and he is charged with 1 count of sodomy. You can imagine her absolute relief. Now, this woman is amazing because she goes to court and she stood up and she faced him. She looked him in the eye and recounted the horrific details of what he had done to her and the absolute fear that she endured that day. Now, Barbara Hendrickson also took the stand and testified against him about the harrowing events of that day. Brave, brave women. On the 21st of April 1976, Charles Campbell is found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison with a minimum of 7 years to serve. And he had also pled guilty to that burglary offence. And for that, he got 15 years with a 5-year minimum. In total, the two sentences together, the 30 years and the 15 years, Renae thought that it was going to be 30 years and 15 years consecutively, which is 45 years. It wasn't. It didn't turn out to be that. But even concurrently, he's still going to be behind bars for 30 years with a 7-year minimum. A long time. During his sentencing, his extensive criminal record, it was presented, and the consensus was clear that Charles Campbell was not fit to be on the streets. So this 30-year sentence was exactly right, and Renae breathed this sigh of relief. She could get on with her life. And he began his sentence on the 11th of May 1976. He was sent to Walla Walla State Penitentiary. And you can imagine the absolute relief for Renae after the last year of living in fear, not knowing if he was going to turn up at her door again. She could kind of breathe, could just get on with her life again. Or so she thought. Now Charles Campbell is behind bars, where he belongs. And Renae, she is picking up the pieces of her life. Obviously, the trauma of sexual assault never fades, but she did the best that she could to rebuild her life. She worked as a beautician and also an accountant. She was a single mother. She was determined to be this strong example for Shannah, and she also wanted to provide her daughter everything that she needed. And all the while, she did maintain this good relationship with her husband. She was in regular contact with her in-laws, and she also had the Hendricksons still across the street, who were always happy to lend a hand. And basically things were beginning to look up for her. That was until December 1977, when Renae received the devastating news that Jack had been attacked in his home by an intruder. Basically, Jack had answered the door of his Seattle home, thinking that it was a delivery. Now, a man, he walked into his home carrying a package. And this man, he wished Jack a happy Christmas. And then without warning, the man tied Jack to a chair and doused him with petrol. And then lit a match and literally set Jack on fire. Miraculously, Jack survived, only just. The burns he suffered were absolutely catastrophic. They left him in excruciating pain. He had extensive scarring. He had to wear like a rubber suit at all times to basically protect his skin. Now you can imagine the attack on Jack. It left Renae paralysed with fear again. Jack said that he couldn't recognise his attacker. He didn't know who this man was. It was random. But for Renae, she is convinced that Campbell somehow orchestrated it. Now, it wasn't Campbell. He is behind bars, serving this prison sentence for the burglary and for her assault. So he is definitely behind bars, but that does not mean that he didn't orchestrate the attack out of revenge. Either way, Jack was physically and emotionally shattered. His life spiraled out of control. He was depressed. And tragically, on the 29th of April 1978, so just 5 months after the attack, he was killed in a car accident while driving home from his parents' house. He was just 37 years old. Now, it's a really, really weird one. Basically, the car that he was driving, it veered off the road. He was kind of taking a bend, and it veered off the road and collided head-on with a tree, and it killed him instantly. There were no other vehicles involved, and there were no witnesses either. And this was a road that he had driven countless times. The weather was clear, all the things that make it unlikely that he just kind of lost control of the vehicle himself. But obviously not impossible. It could well have just been a tragic accident. But obviously there is speculation that there's something more sinister involved, that he was run off the road, or he was depressed as well. Could he have done this himself? It's frustrating as hell because we don't know. Either way, Renae, she is heartbroken, and Shannah has just lost her father. And once again, they're having to rebuild their lives. And Renae did have this comfort knowing that Campbell was behind bars, and she believed he was going to be behind bars for years to come. She knew in the back of her mind that there would come a time when he wouldn't be, and that she would have to possibly think about leaving. But for now, she felt safe and secure in her home. But she was still very, very safety conscious, still very, very paranoid, as you're going to be. And she was very particular about making sure she had good locks installed on the windows, on the doors. She adopted an Afghan hound as well. Obviously, it was a loyal companion to them, but also gave them a little bit of extra protection, that little sense of security that they needed. So if we move forward to the winter of 1981, it's 7 years since Renae was attacked, and Campbell is still behind bars, or at least he should be behind bars. And Renae's mother, Hilda Ehlers, she was visiting her daughter from North Dakota. Now, Hilda was completely unaware of the attack on Renae 7 years before. Basically, Renae was fiercely independent and resilient, and she didn't want to worry her mother. And so Hilda didn't have any idea. However, when she stayed with her daughter over that winter, she kind of sensed that things were just not right, because there was this uneasiness going on in the home. Little things were happening where she was left questioning if everything was as okay as Renae was making out. So little things like one evening, Renae's dog, who was usually very, very calm, suddenly started barking frantically. This dog was kind of pacing between the doors and the windows. It was growing increasingly agitated. It was as if it sensed someone outside. On another occasion, Hilda noticed Renae just stood at the window staring intently outside. You know, a mother's instinct, she knows, and she knew that something was amiss. Like, why was her daughter just kind of staring outside? And Renae said everything was okay, but clearly something was amiss. And clearly the fact that Renae was just staring outside, she could sense something as well. Somebody watching the house potentially. Then in January 1982, this is creepy as hell, Renae discovers large footprints in the snow beneath the windows of her house. Now the house is set back from the road. And that made the discovery all the more alarming, because nobody should have just been walking around her property. And she mentions this actually to the Hendricksons, and Don admitted that he had also seen similar footprints near his home. Obviously, this revelation left Renae deeply, deeply concerned. It's really creepy. It kind of makes me think of the, what's it called? The Hinterkaifeck murders, where the father, I think it was, he found all these footprints in the snow. This was in Germany. I don't know when it was a long time ago. But basically his entire family is just wiped out. But it's really, really creepy. It is like a kind of horror movie. If you're somewhere that there shouldn't be any footprints outside, waking up and you're finding these footprints leading to your home would be terrifying. I'd be out of there personally, but yeah, it's pretty scary. Now, a few weeks later, Hilda, she's returned home. And once again, Renae suffers another heartbreak, and basically her dog had nipped a child. So she ended up having to give her dog away. And this was an awful, awful thing for her, because not only had they lost a companion, but it left her feeling exposed, and this sense of security was gone. And basically, footprints, uneasy feelings of people watching the house, all these things, she needed all the security that she could get. So basically 3 months after the footprints outside of her home, Renae got very, very ill. Now it's April 1982. And she was very, very poorly. She was recovering from a very bad case of strep throat. Now, Barbara Hendrickson, her close friend, her devoted neighbour, she had been helping to care for Renae by taking her easy to swallow foods like, homemade soups and whatnot. Now, Barbara had also been keeping an eye on Shannah, who was 8 at this time, making sure she got to school safely, that kind of thing. She just sounds like the most wonderfulest neighbour you would ever want to have. Really, really caring lady. On Wednesday the 14th of April, Barbara visited Renae in the morning, and she promised to return later that day. That afternoon, as Barbara stepped outside of her home to collect her mail, she met Shannah coming home from school. And she told Shannah to tell her mother, that she'd be over very soon. At 4:20, she goes over to Renae's home to go and do her afternoon checkup on everybody. Almost a couple of hours pass. It gets to kind of 6 o'clock-ish. And Don begins to worry a little bit because he knows that the two women, they can talk for hours. So normally he wouldn't be too worried about it. But he also knew Renae was poorly, and the chances of her being able to talk for hours when you've got strep throat are pretty slim. So he puts his coat on and heads across the road to Renae's house. The second he gets to her house, he realised that something was very, very wrong, because he saw that the sliding glass doors that led to the kitchen was slightly ajar. Now, we know how safety conscious Renae was, so the chances that her door would be slightly open, it concerned Don. Now, as he stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet. Now, there are 3 females in this house, and I think he's expecting either he's going to be hearing Barbara pottering around. Shannah's at home, she's 8, so she's going to be pottering around, playing, watching TV, whatever. He just expects there to be some kind of noise of there being 3 females in that house. But the house is totally silent. All he can hear is a tap running. He turns the tap off and he begins to walk around the house and notices that a chair has been knocked over. He also sees that the house has been ransacked, and basically things aren't looking good. So literally, with the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, he walks down the hallway leading to the bedrooms, and that's when he sees his 51-year-old wife, Barbara, his wife of 34 years, the love of his life. She is lying on her back in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed from ear to ear, leaving a 7-inch wound. The blood had soaked into the carpet and she had died from a massive hemorrhage. Devastated, absolutely devastated, in shock. He knows that somewhere in that house, Shannah and Renae are going to be. He continues down the hallway. Shannah's bedroom was empty. He breathed a sigh of relief for a moment, anyway. For a moment, he felt a flicker of hope that maybe they were okay, maybe they were hiding somewhere. He continued to Renae's bedroom and tentatively he opened her door, absolutely terrified of what he was going to find. Renae Wicklund's brutalised body lay on the floor next to the bed. She was naked, lying on her back, as if slightly posed, that kind of thing that some killers like to do. They like to shock because they're sick. Renae had been beaten with a blunt instrument on her head, back, upper chest. Her face had been so savagely beaten that she was practically unrecognisable. Her autopsy would later reveal nearly every single bone in her face had been broken. That is a personal beating. Renae had also been strangled and her throat had been cut with a 7-inch wound from which she had bled to death. She had been raped after death, her genitals mutilated. She had been vaginally assaulted with a blunt instrument which left a 1-inch cut in her vaginal wall. The attack on Renae, it was so savage. Like I say, that was a personal attack. Whoever had done this bore profound animosity towards her, and we know damn well who is going to be angry at Renae. Across the room lay the crumpled body of 8-year-old Shannah. She was face down in a pool of blood. Shannah had also been strangled. Her throat had been slashed with such force that she was practically decapitated. Shannah had lost so much blood that even getting a sample from her for testing was difficult. They had to scrape it off the carpet. This man had taken everything. He'd ransacked the home, stolen Renae's possessions, her jewellery, her private things, going so far as ripping the earrings from their ears. Don, he'd seen enough. He called the police and stumbled outside into the street, absolutely overcome with grief, absolutely consumed by grief. Snohomish County deputies arrived shortly afterwards, followed by detectives, obviously. Don, he was absolutely heartbroken by what he had witnessed in that house. It was a horror that was literally going to haunt him for the rest of his life. Now, it became clear that their killer made absolutely no effort to cover his tracks or conceal his identity. You know, there was blood in the sink where he'd washed his hands afterwards. He'd left a bloody handprint on a drinking glass. The investigators, they canvassed the area and there were loads of sightings of him. He was unmistakable, this tall, bushy-haired man, seen loitering near her home. He was seen hiding in bushes, for God's sake. Most witnesses said as well he seemed to be unsteady on his feet, so basically he'd been drinking. Witnesses also saw a car backed into the woods near Renee's home, and he was seen running towards the woods, probably towards the parked car. When they did catch up to him, it was going to be pretty obvious that it was him. He'd left enough witnesses, he'd left enough physical evidence that when they knew who the killer was, it would be easy to link him to the crimes. Right now, they don't know who it is. The detectives, they began piecing together kind of a timeline of the events, and their theory was that the killer had entered the house before Barbara arrived. Now, given the excessive violence that Renee had endured, it was pretty obvious that she was the target. Shannah obviously walked into that house, came face to face with Campbell. She wasn't the target. She was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, this is absolutely tragic because the investigators found a shoe print on Renee's leg and they matched this shoe print to a shoe that Shannah was wearing, which basically means that as she was trying to flee at some point, she stepped on her mother's body. She saw what that man had done to her mother. That sight of her mother's brutalized, mutilated body is the last thing that little 8-year-old girl saw. And then again, Barbara, she entered the house unknowingly. She probably walked down to the bedrooms, and that's when she came face to face with Campbell. She ran, and she was literally found at the entrance to the hallway. So she was like feet away from getting out of the house. It's just so tragically sad because, again, she was kind of collateral damage, although he was angry with her as well because she testified as well. So anyway, after Campbell had murdered them all, he then ransacked the house and he stole all their jewellery. He sat at the kitchen table and he had a drink and he had a sandwich, as you do. This man is just unreal. And yeah, I mean, you know, in some ways that's good because he left a load of physical evidence behind because he's dumb. Like I always say, they're bloody dumb. At this point, obviously, nobody has any idea who has done this. Don told the detectives that the only person he could think of who might wish Renee any harm was a man who had assaulted her 8 years earlier. However, it couldn't possibly be this man because this man was behind bars. Right? Wrong. Now, the police obviously didn't hold up much hope that it was going to be this man because they were told that he was behind bars. As a precaution, however, they decided to look into Renee's attack from 1974, and what they uncovered was deeply unsettling. In 1981, just a year before Renee's death, Charles Campbell had been released on work release to a halfway house just 10 miles away from Renee's home. He had been released after just 6 years without Renee ever being notified. She had no idea. It's an absolute travesty. Why the hell was this man walking the streets after 6 years? Now, they looked at his records. Basically, what had happened. In May 1976, Campbell began his sentence at Walla Walla State Penitentiary. Now, that was a high security prison. Less than a month later, in June, he was transferred to Washington State Reformatory in Monroe. And this reformatory was a lower security prison. This is after a month. Now, Campbell's own mother, Betty Lou, she even wrote a letter to the state warning that moving him to a lower security facility was a terrible idea and it would end very, very badly. According to Betty Lou, Charles had sexual issues and strange ideas about women. She also claimed he had sexually assaulted their family dog while growing up. Now, Charles denied these accusations. Instead, he said, "No, I didn't assault the dog, but I did strangle him to death for not listening to me." That's okay then. Despite the warnings, despite Betty Lou's concerns, he was transferred anyway. They transferred Charles to a lower security prison. But true to his mother's prediction, Campbell began causing trouble almost immediately. In September 1976, he was caught with a gallon of homemade liquor, which he had brewed using yeast stolen from the kitchen reformatory. A year later, he assaulted an inmate, knocking him down and inflicting head injuries that required medical treatment. On New Year's Eve in 1977, Campbell went to hit a nurse. The guards intervened, so he didn't, but he was going to. By 1979, he had sexually assaulted a roommate and threatened to kill him if he reported the incident. This was not the first cellmate he had sexually assaulted, by the way. Basically, Charles Campbell ruled his fellow inmates with terror, bullying the weaker ones to obtain drugs for him and to submit to sodomy. They were absolutely terrified of him. They gave him the nickname One Punch because his fist was so powerful. Even the guards, who were totally aware of his drug trafficking, they were afraid of him and asked that he be transferred from Monroe back to the higher security state penitentiary at Walla Walla. So he does not have the best of records. At some point during his time at the reformatory, Campbell had also become romantically involved with a woman called Judith Dirks. She was a counsellor at the facility. Their relationship obviously was wrong on many levels, but it did ultimately lead to Dirks being dismissed from her position. But obviously he has got power through her, and they continue to see each other after her dismissal, and they actually go on to have a son in 1982. Now, Campbell underwent, obviously, psychological assessments whilst in prison, and in a nutshell, they said that he was uncaring of others, he was conscienceless, malevolently intolerable of the social order which imprisons him, and imminently harmful to all who directly or indirectly capture his attention or interest. In other words, in short, he was deemed as extremely dangerous, with no regard for anybody else. So here we have a man who has a history of committing misdemeanors inside. He is violent. People are terrified of him. The psychologists say that he is very, very dangerous and he has no regard for anybody else. Yet, somehow, he appears before a parole board and his mandatory sentence is waived, which makes him eligible for minimum custody status. Not only had he not served the 7 years minimum, this decision was made based on the parole board coming to the conclusion that Campbell was a model prisoner. This is not entirely the parole board's fault, because basically the paperwork that they had been given only cited 3 minor infractions during Campbell's first year at Monroe. And so they were led to believe that he was a model prisoner. Had the parole board been aware of his true behaviour, I'm pretty sure their decision would have been very, very different. So, was somebody covering up? Did somebody doctor the report? Was it just poor admin? But it gets worse, because obviously after Renae's death, investigations are carried out into how the hell Campbell could have been released after 6 years. And what the Washington State Parole Board would discover is that the Monroe Reformatory had failed to forward copies of hundreds of prison infractions to them. And so as a result, countless prisoners had been released without proper evaluation of their behaviour during their incarcerations. So it wasn't just Campbell. This was hundreds of prisoners who were wrongly released, who were walking the streets when they shouldn't have been. The system was completely flawed, utterly flawed. Where were the checks and balances going on here? So now that he is deemed to be a model prisoner, just a few months later, in September 1981, he's transferred to an honor farm, which is basically a minimum security facility. which focuses on rehabilitating and preparing inmates for reintegration into society, despite the fact that somebody like Campbell is not somebody that you want to be reintegrated back into society, but that's what they work on. But a month later, in 1981, he was then moved to the Monroe Work Release Facility, and this is where they're released back into the community to work. So they are still monitored, they're still carrying out their sentences, but with very, very minimal kind of supervision. In fact, we know it's not just work that he was doing, and we know that the supervision was not great, because whilst he was on this work release, you know, his ex-wife, the one that fled with his daughter, the one that he beat up terribly even while she was pregnant and threw knives at his daughter, on Christmas Day in 1981, he left his work release and raped her. And allegedly, he raped her a couple more times as well afterwards, whilst he was on this work release. Now, she did go to the police in March, but the police advised her that the case was too weak to pursue in court, and no action was taken. So Campbell remained on this work release program and was walking around in the community. And this makes me so angry, because here we have two incredibly strong women. We have the wife who is reporting it, and we have Renae who reports it, and look what happens. She's not protected adequately afterwards. We have two strong women that do the right thing. But this is exactly the reason why so many women are afraid to report sexual assault, because no bloody action is taken. Only around 16% of sexual assaults are reported to the police in the UK. This means that the majority of survivors do not come forward. This figure is 25% in the US. Now, looking at prosecution rates of the cases that are reported in the US, only about 1.3% result in a charge. Ultimately, not very encouraging figures. Now, if we look at the barriers to reporting, survivors cite fear of not being believed, fear of retaliation, lack of trust in the justice system, stigma, the trauma of having to go through the legal process and having to relive that trauma during the investigations and the trials. Is it any wonder that women do not come forward when they have been sexually assaulted? Renae and Campbell's ex-wife, they did the right things. They reported their assaults, but what do they get in return? It just upsets me. Now, we're going back a bit to the 70s, 80s, and things were probably not as good then. I'm going to tell you, in the 90s, I was assaulted one night walking home. This guy, he dragged me to a bridge, smashed my head against a wall, was inappropriate. I was very, very, very lucky because he was disturbed and things didn't get as bad as they would have done if he was not disturbed. I reported it to the police. The police came round to my house, and do you know what I was told? I was told that I should not have been walking home down that street at that time of night. This was a female police officer who basically told me it was my fault for walking down the street. I should have taken the long way home that night. Now, yeah, I probably should have. But how about, instead of victim shaming me, saying it's his fault because he has no right to go around attacking people? And so that is why cases like this make me so goddamn angry, because this is why women are terrified of coming forward. We've got Renae in the 70s, we've got the ex-wife in the 80s. So even though I'm trying to make some allowances for the fact that this is way back, have things changed? I've just given you the statistics. Clearly, women are still afraid to come forward. So anyway, a couple of months later, the Monroe programme that he was on, it actually closed. And this is when he was transferred to the Everett Work Release Facility. And it's a very, very similar thing to the Monroe facility. He's allowed out into the workplace. He's allowed in the community. He's working. He's wandering around. There is obviously supervision. He has to go back at night. There is curfews, things like that. There are strict rules. But is he being watched? Not enough, because this facility, it was 10 miles away from Renae's home, and he was clearly watching her. He was driving past her house. He was leaving footprints in the snow outside of her house. And all the while, nobody is informed that he is even in the area. He is literally a couple of blocks away from the Snohomish County Courthouse. And there was no notification to the sheriff's office that he had been released on this work release program. There was no notification to the sheriff's office or Renae. For God's sake, the person who really should have been notified was Renae. And so tragically, within just 6 weeks, he went on to commit the horrific triple homicide against Renae, Barbara, and Shannah. It was a catastrophic failure of the justice system. And it was a failure that left the investigators, as well as the community, absolutely reeling as they grappled with just how goddamn preventable this tragedy was. And the thing is, along with that anger, there was the fear. And what actually happened at the time was the number of women reporting rapes and sexual assaults, they dropped dramatically because women were terrified about reporting rapes, because they couldn't trust the justice system. They couldn't trust that the men who had attacked them would be put away. So like I said, Campbell, he left lots of physical evidence tying him to the crimes. There were lots of witnesses. So it wasn't very difficult for the police to piece it all together. They went to the Everett Work Release Programme and they were informed on that evening of the 14th of April that basically he had returned to the halfway house within the curfew, but he was basically intoxicated. And he also tested positive for 5 different drugs in his system. Now, given the halfway house's strict rules against alcohol and drug use, he was promptly sent back to the Monroe Reformatory. Right, okay, strict rules about alcohol and drug use, but not strict rules about raping women. Got it. Obviously, DNA, fingerprints, all that was collected. They matched the fingerprints to that bloody glass that was found in Renae's kitchen. During a search of his belongings, they found Renae's jewellery. They were able to match the clothes that he was seen wearing. And when the investigators checked the place where he was supposed to be working, he hadn't turned up on that day. That's because he was murdering 3 innocent women. And then I think the icing on the cake was a fellow inmate who was also on the work release programme came forward and basically said that he had spent the evening with Charles by the Snohomish River. They were drinking, which is why Charles was intoxicated when he got back to the halfway house. And this man said that he was very jittery and excitable, which is just awful, because imagine being so kind of amped up from committing these crimes that you're kind of excitable about it. I mean, that's disgusting. But this guy said that he was behaving very, very suspiciously. At one point, he kind of excused himself and drove his car down to the riverbank. And he was acting like he was trying to conceal something. And based on this tip, the police dispatched divers to the Snohomish River, and they pulled out evidence that was tied to Renae's home. There were things like a bracelet, earrings, necklaces, pottery, and brass ornaments. You know how I said that she loved the farm life and growing up on the farm was a little bit of her? Well, she'd taken some ornaments from her farm and she used them to decorate her home with. And anyway, these were found kind of just discarded in the river, just discarded. Her life has been discarded in the river in that way. And there was no disputing that Charles had done this. And on 19th of April 1982, Charles Campbell was charged with 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. So after they do the psychiatric stuff to make sure he's competent enough to stand trial, all that stuff, the trial begins in November 1982. Now, everybody knew about this case. There was a lot of anger and a lot of fear going on. Now, the defence, who were absolutely crap, they tried to say the police had basically unfairly focused on Campbell due to his criminal history and his prior connection to Renae. And they basically alleged that the police didn't really investigate anybody else. All this was a load of rubbish because the police did investigate other people. This one, however, the defence pull off. It's another blood boiler. The defence wanted the sexual assault charges dismissed. They argued that because Renae was assaulted post-mortem, they claimed this did not legally constitute sexual assault. A coroner stood up and actually testified that the brain activity could continue for several minutes after death, and Renae may well have been aware of the assault. But regardless of whether she was aware of it or not, the dead cannot consent. The judge accepted the defence's argument and dismissed the charges. Oh yeah. Now the prosecution, to be fair, they didn't have to try too hard because, it was overwhelming. But they had all the physical evidence and they had numerous witnesses. Now, some of these witnesses included people who obviously saw Campbell on the day that he murdered Renae and Barbara and Shannah, people that saw the car, people that saw him lurking in bushes, all that stuff. One of the key witnesses was actually Judith Dirks, the girlfriend who he actually went on to have a son with. But she testified that Campbell had this deep hatred towards Renae and Barbara, who he basically blamed for his imprisonment. And she revealed that Campbell had obtained court transcripts from his 1976 trial, which included Renae's address. And it was this information that he used to find out that she was still in the same house. Seriously? I don't know how the hell he got that court information, but that's how he could find out where she lived and that she hadn't moved. And it was using this information that he then proceeded to stalk her and hide in bushes and all this stuff. Dirks also said that on the morning of the murders, Campbell had appeared at her house visibly drunk. And later that day, she noticed that one of her large butcher knives with a 6-inch blade was missing. There were other witnesses. There was another woman who the prosecution claimed that he tried to rape on the day of the murders. The ex-wife also testified to say he had left during work release and raped her a number of times. There was also the guy who spent the evening with him at the Snohomish River. He testified, although the defence, being crap, then said, well, actually, it could have been him that did it. Who's to say it wasn't him that committed the murders? The defence literally were clutching here because it was pretty obvious. There were numerous witnesses, numerous physical evidence, just the case against Campbell was overwhelming. So on the 26th of November 1982, Charles Campbell was found guilty of 3 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. His motive was clear: revenge. Obviously, he couldn't forgive Renae for reporting his sexual assault to the police. Festering resentment had driven him to commit these horrific crimes. He was sentenced to death. And at the time, death row inmates, this is in Washington state, they could choose between hanging and lethal injection. Now, he refused to choose, saying that to do so would constitute cruel and unusual punishment akin to suicide, which he said was against his religion. Murdering people apparently is fine under his religion. This dude, he is like all the other snivelling little cowards when it comes to their own punishments and facing their own deaths.
Death is not instantaneous with hanging, and that a lot of people, it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes to die. And that's a long time to be, hanging up there. It's a very ghastly way to die.
So anyway, he didn't choose, so the state chose for him, and they chose that he was going to be hanged. And predictably, he immediately filed a series of appeals, basically delaying his execution. He filed 3 appeals, and all the legal kind of ramblings that went on with these appeals lasted for over a decade. In the middle of it all, there was this debate on whether hanging did in fact constitute cruel and unusual punishment, and it was determined that it didn't. They said that the death was instant, so it wasn't cruel and it wasn't unusual. On the 15th of April 1994, so it took from 1982 to 1994, the state lifted the stay of execution, and so his execution date was scheduled for 27th of May 1994. And actually, he would become the last person to be executed by hanging in Washington state. Now, as an aside here, I actually want to mention very, very quickly something else. Now, you remember I said he had this relationship with Judith Dirks, who was a counsellor in the prison where he was, and she got dismissed, and they carried on seeing each other and she got pregnant. Well, they had a son, and his name was Jacob Campbell. And basically, throughout the last 10, 12 years, whilst he is appealing to not be executed, his son is visiting him on death row. So Jacob is actually 12 by the time his father was eventually executed. But until that point, he kept visiting his father in prison. I think he and Judith visited quite regular. But basically, he tried to have a relationship with his father. And from what I can tell, they had quite a good little relationship, as much as they could, with a sheet of glass between them anyway. I'm saying this because we're going through these feelings of, thank God he is going to pay for what he did. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that whilst there's the victims on that side, it's very, very easy to forget about the victims on the perpetrator's side. And here, Jacob, his son, he is clearly a victim of his father as well. This little boy petitioned the governor because he did not want his father to die. And it's really, really sad. And actually, what happened was Jacob actually grew up to be an angry man like his father. He did actually do a stint inside. I have no idea what for, but it looked like he was kind of going the same way as his father. Like I've said, the ripple effects, it carries on down through generations. Jacob was a victim as well. Now, he did, from what I can tell, he has turned his life around and he's actually working as, I think, a social worker or something. He's doing good things now, basically, in the community. He seems to be happy. Things are looking good. And I'm so, so pleased that that is the way that things have turned out. I just think it's really, really interesting to try and give that other perspective and just to see how so many people can be affected by one person's actions. So as we're about to go in and talk about Charles Campbell's execution, just bear in mind he has two children that we know about anyway, who were left hurting, who were left dealing with the pain and the trauma also of what their father had done and the pain of losing their father. Jacob actually has a blog. I'll leave the details if you are interested in learning any more about Jacob. So on the 27th of May 1994, Charles Rodman Campbell, he faced justice at the gallows at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Even finding an executioner actually was difficult to carry out the hanging because this hadn't been done for like 30 years. The state ultimately had to pay a significant amount of money to somebody to carry out this hanging. Now, like I've said, he's a snivelling little coward, and true to form, he resisted until the very, very end. When the guards arrived to remove him from his cell on death row and to basically transfer him to the holding cell near the execution chamber, he was lying on the floor, rigid, fetal position, refused to comply, refused to any commands, refused to be handcuffed. The guards were forced to use pepper spray to subdue him and cuff him and then transport him back to the holding cell.
Mr. Campbell was unresponsive to a command to cuff up, that is to back up to the cuff port in the intensive management unit cell that he occupied this afternoon. And indeed, we did administer pepper spray to him, at which time, without incident, we were able to subdue him and cuff him and transport him from the intensive management unit to the holding cell of the chamber.
Now, shortly after midnight, which is when I think he was scheduled to be executed, they arrived in his cell And he was so terrified at the thought of his own death that his legs would not support him, and he had to be assisted, kind of semi-carried basically, because he was just that terrified. His wrists and his ankles were bound, and he was strapped to a board for support. At 12:08, he was led into the execution chamber. According to some witnesses who were viewing the execution, they said that he was kind of thrashing about violently. So there was some struggle getting this noose around his neck. Eventually, it was secured, obviously, and the sentence was carried out. He dropped 5 feet 7 inches to his death. He had no final words, not even a little sorry. I mean, judging from the thank you that he gave Renae, I'm not sure his final words would have been pretty profound anyway. He was 39 and he was pronounced dead at 12:14 a.m. Campbell's death was swift, it was painless, an absolute stark contrast to the pain, the terror, the horror that he inflicted on Renae, Shannah, and Barbara. So after the murders, Campbell's ex-wife successfully sued the state for negligence. She argued that if they had taken her rape allegations seriously, he would have been sent back to prison, and that potentially would have saved all 3 lives. So again, a strong, strong woman, because even though it's all too late, she's still fighting for this change. Renae's mother, Hilda, she also filed a negligence suit against the state, stating that they had an obligation to inform victims when their attackers were released early. Renae had no idea. She believed Charles was serving 30 to 45 years behind bars. The state's failure to notify her left her vulnerable. Nobody knows what she would have done if she found out. The point is, she wasn't given that choice in the first place to decide what to do. Now, Don, Barbara's husband, also made a similar argument, and it also resulted in compensation. So that's good. So obviously the positive to come from this case was the implementation of a voluntary advance notification system in Washington state, which informs victims when their attackers are moved or released. This obviously came way too late for Renae, Shannah and Barbara, but I think they would be happy to know that something is now in place protecting other victims down the line. Now, Don Hendrickson did actually dedicate himself to helping other victims of crime, working with families and friends of missing persons, victims of violent crimes. He did good things, but the trauma of not just his wife's death, but what he saw in that house, it did deeply affect him. He passed away in 1999 and he was laid to rest beside his beloved wife, Barbara. Renae and Shannah Wicklund, they are buried side by side in Jamestown in North Dakota, far away from Clearview, Washington. It's tragic, isn't it? She fell in love with that place and it just turned into an absolute nightmare for her. But she ended up back home to the farm area, the place that she loved, the place that was in her heart, and they were far, far away now from Clearview. And so, yeah, that is the absolutely heartbreaking and frustrating case. What an absolute injustice. This was totally preventable. Now, I don't know if you remember, but way back, when he went on that run for a year, and I said that he did do something else. I didn't tell you about it at the time because literally nobody had any idea what else he had done. So in April 1975, during this year, so he's basically on the run between Christmas 1974 when he attacked Renae, and they picked him up for that burglary in January 1976. So just over a year. April 1975, a 25-year-old University of Washington student called Hallie and Seaman disappeared. She was just 2 terms away from completing her master's degree in architecture. Smart little cookie she was. The following day, her body was discovered hidden in bushes in Seattle. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed multiple times. Her station wagon was found burned out 4 miles south of where her body was located. Now, at the time, Hallie's murder went unsolved. There was never any connection to Campbell, nothing. In fact, her murder remained a mystery for nearly 5 decades. In 2002, detectives analysed the DNA evidence from Hallie's murder and created a male genetic profile. So they had this profile, but it didn't match anything in CODIS, which is the FBI's national database of DNA from certain felons. Now, at this time, Campbell's crimes, they had occurred before CODIS was created in 1998. So Campbell's DNA was not on CODIS. Now, a few years later in 2019, so it's actually quite recent, it's only, 5 years ago, new legislation in Washington expanded the criteria for DNA profiles in CODIS, which basically allowed for older cases to be included. And as a result, Campbell's DNA was then added to the database. And then this led to a match and identified Campbell as the likely killer. So it took until 2019 to basically link Campbell to this other crime. Tragically, obviously, Hallie is never, ever going to see justice for what Campbell did to her. But at least her family can now find some solace in knowing the truth about her killer. Even after what he did to Renae, the fact that he then went on to do this to Hallie just shows that he was not a man that was going to stop. He was not going to stop doing what he was doing. And I'm mentioning Hallie because Hallie is barely mentioned, and I just think it's important to shine a light on forgotten victims. Hopefully I've done this case justice. I really, really hope so. If you think I have, please feel free to drop me a like or a subscribe. I would really, really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody that has already liked any of my videos or subscribed. I really, really do appreciate any support that I can get. That is everything on this case. My question to you actually is, because it's really bloody annoying, is Jack Wicklund, what the actual hell do you think that Charles Campbell was responsible? He was clearly behind bars at the time, so he clearly physically didn't do it, but did he orchestrate it? So do let me know what you think. So that is everything. Yeah, I don't know what I'm thinking about because there's nothing else to say really. You look after yourselves and take good care of yourselves, take good care of your loved ones, and hopefully see you back here again for another true crime case at my true criminal abode. Bye.